Hi, welcome back to Conversations. I'm Bill Kristol. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Tim Snyder, professor of history at Yale, distinguished scholar of Ukraine, Russia, Central and Eastern Europe, author of the definitive work Bloodlands, and also author of more popular works on Russia and European history, and also on tyranny, freedom, and other big and important topics. Unlike many professors, Tim Snyder's scholarly books are accessible to the rest of us, and his popular books are based on scholarship, so that's a good combination. And but just last week, your class on, what was it, Hitler, Stalin, and us, or something like that, was disrupted at Yale, but you've survived that well. Anyway, Tim, thanks for joining me, and let's discuss Ukraine.
Okay, glad to be with you. Let's do it.
Let's do it. So, 2 years into the war, where do we stand in your judgment in terms of both the military situation and the broader geopolitical situation? And then we can go back and look a little bit at the sort of what happened before and then what might happen next.
Okay. I mean, I guess the military situation, there's sort of the objective and the subjective side. I think subjectively, if you're an American, there are sort of two problems. The first is that the Biden administration, although it generally, in my view, has done the right thing and has made a number of adjustments and has been capable of rethinking. In 2022, when things were really critical and sensitive, and when the tide of war could have been turned, we spent too much time making decisions, and our decisions were based too often on what we thought wouldn't make Putin nervous, or they were based on virtue signaling. Like, is this weapon system the right weapon system at the time? And let's think about how good people will be if we supply it, as opposed to what the Ukrainians actually needed to finish the war victoriously. Like, that's the only way to really think about a war, is how do you finish it victoriously? And then where we are now, of course, is that we're not supplying anything. Rheinmetall, one German company, is out producing us in terms of artillery shells. The North Koreans are out supplying the entire West, and we, for our own political reasons, which are unfortunately connected to Russia's political reasons, are at the moment not doing anything at all for Ukraine. So that's the subjective part. And what I want to stress is that we're the weak link. America is the weak link. The Russians see us as the weak link, and unfortunately, they're correct. On the battlefield, the Ukrainians are doing, I would say, surprisingly well. They've cleared out a huge swath of the Black Sea, of the Russia's Black Sea Fleet, which is allowing them to supply the Near East and Africa with food. They've destroyed a huge number of Russian aircraft in the last few weeks, largely, if not entirely, freeing the sky. The Russians are on the offensive now, but it's slow and it's costing them. So this is still a war that Ukraine can win, but whether or not they win it depends upon whether they have allies who are capable of seeing the political stakes and capable of behaving in a way which is consistent with, simple military logic, which is, what do you need to do to help your ally to win?
And if we do finally get this aid package through and the Europeans continue to be, we can come back to this, I think, but, in my judgment, better than they might have been, for pretty standing up pretty well for Ukraine. You think this, for now, it's kind of, I don't know if it's really a frozen conflict technically, but it's kind of a not moving very much conflict along the main lines of battle. You think that's sustainable for Ukraine for a while? I mean, even if ultimately one hopes they will win, but you're not panicked about the current situation.
No, I mean, let me talk about frozen conflict for a second, because frozen conflict is that's a deliberate political aim. You go into part of Moldova, you freeze the conflict. And I would want to avoid that term, because it suggests that nothing's ever going to change, but also because it's an aim in itself. Like, if we accept it's a frozen conflict, then we say, oh, well, then there's kind of nothing we can do. It's frozen. So it's an active hot war. It's a war of attrition in which you're right.
Isn't it also, it's a Russian aim in some conflicts, whereas here their aim isn't really a frozen conflict, is it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, their aim, as they make clear every day in the statements of their highest political authorities and their propaganda shows every evening, their aim is to destroy the Ukrainian state. I mean, for people who want to be fooled, there's still stories out there about, like, the Russian language or NATO or whatever. But what they tell us every day is they're trying to destroy Ukrainian state and society. That's their war aim. And so long as they haven't done that, they're going to keep trying to do that. On the Ukrainian side, they can sustain this for a long time, provided that they don't engage in, ill thought through offensive operations and lose too many people. the main constraint that they have is that there are only so many Ukrainians, and it's reasonable of them to be taking that constraint into account. Russia has more people, but also the Russian leadership doesn't care at all about losing its own people, whereas Ukrainian leadership, to its great credit, does care. They have to balance preserving territory, winning the war, and not losing too many people on the battlefield. But I think they've been very clever about things that look asymmetric, like these sea drones. They've been very clever about how they fought the war so far. And again, so I think so long as we subjectively act as though they can win the war, I think they can eventually win the war. And I mean, to be clear, by winning the war, I don't mean that they're going to drive out every Russian soldier off every square centimeter of Ukrainian territory. It's that I think a system like the Ukrainian one actually has more staying power than a system like the Putinist one. And war ends when politics buckles, right? It ends when one side or the other can't sustain it any longer. And I think if the Ukrainians have support, the weaker side in the end is going to be the Russian side.
Yeah, that's it's so interesting. I'm going to get back to us being the weak link, which I mean is a terrible thing as an American, I've got to say, to acknowledge, but it's true, I think, for now. But have you been surprised? I mean, you're a student of, and I think mostly an admirer of modern or current Ukraine, or and current being even a couple of 3, 4, 5 years ago. But have you been surprised by just the performance of the country, the system, the government, the civil society? It seems pretty impressive and awfully admirable. But
I mean, I was one of the. I mean, this question is a little awkward because it's awkward when you're right.
yeah.
Like it's not awkward when you're wrong in American public because when you're wrong, everybody just forgets it, right?
Well, I'll put it in a better way then. I guess knowing much less sort of was pleasantly surprised. So tell me why, explain what was happening in Ukraine that people like me didn't fully grasp.
Yeah. So let me start. So yeah, because I publicly said Zelensky's going to stay and they're going to fight, and that like basically got laughed at by the American foreign policy establishment. And that's so I did think they were going to stay. He was going to stay and they were going to fight. I didn't think they would do as well as they ended up doing. So here I'm going to join in your expectation. I want to start there somewhere else, which is like why I'm just going to pose it a different way, which is why didn't we take Ukraine seriously? Or to put it in the sharpest possible term, why was our expectation the same as Russia's expectation? Because both inside the Kremlin and inside the Beltway, among both Republicans and Democrats, the expectation was Ukraine is going to fold in a few days. And why did we have that expectation? And I think that expectation arises from like the deep fundamentals, the imponderabilia, like the things that come before we even start talking about history or strategy or politics. I think that comes from a kind of very deep Russian subjective victory, which is Americans and most people in the West until 2022, somewhere deep down thought Russia's a real place and Ukraine is not a real place. And then from that, we kind of, without actually saying that out loud, we reason forward to whatever, they're corrupt, it's a new nation, who knows, like something that we are willing to say out loud. And then from that, we reason to they're going to flee. And I think it's that deep unspoken thing, which was basically mistaken. And that's where maybe I had an edge over other people because I studied the place. In the last 30 years, Ukrainian civil society has become more and more active and self-aware. And, this is relevant for Americans too, successful at defending and pushing democracy forward. Because democracy doesn't just happen, as we like to think. It unhappens. Democracy naturally unhappens. You have to make democracy happen. And this in Ukrainian civil society, step by step, has managed to not only sustain, but make democracy a little bit less imperfect over time. And it's that same civil society then, which is behind the army, which is fighting the war. And it's that same state, which has gotten, it's not perfect, but it's gotten better and better over time rather than worse and worse, which is fighting this war. And then, of course, I think they were also, they were fortunate with their leadership too. It's kind of an argument for democracy that somebody as improbable as Zelensky would win an election. Then people are like, okay, well, this guy's, he's just, what can he do? But it turns out that thinking in terms of how to communicate and thinking in terms of the grand stakes are things that a properly trained actor can do. And that turned out to be it's still very important, but very important in the first year. But I think fundamentally it comes down, Bill, to like just this basic notion that Ukraine's actually a real place. And Russia isn't the thing that it's convinced us that it is. It's something which is more fragile and more new.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, in Ukraine, I'm a Ukrainian friend of mine, acquaintance of mine here in DC. We were having a long conversation about this, and she was asking why Americans don't understand sort of that this is not only worth fighting and worth winning and worth helping them, but it'd be hugely important to have a stable, free, liberal, democratic Ukraine right where it is as a real ally. And it's a positive. It's not just like doing the right thing and helping, a country that's dealing with a terrible neighbor. It's actually a huge strategic advantage. And I don't know if maybe that's just our wars over the last, God knows, 50 years, Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan. We're helping people who I think one could argue were on the better side of these conflicts against dictators and so forth. But they were kind of, it was more us trying to do the right thing and help them. And as she put it well, as I mentioned Vietnam, she said, people need to think of Ukraine as West Germany, not as Vietnam. As not quite right, but I mean, as a big country that will be a very important ally in fighting for freedom and democracy in the future, not simply as a place we kind of have intervened to try to help do the right thing.
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of, this is the problem, is that we don't actually have an analogy. And I mean, there are two differences with Iraq, and these are places where you and I may disagree, but in Iraq, we actually intervened militarily, which we didn't do in Ukraine. Right. We're not going to do. And what we did on false pretenses, and so that's meant that we lost a lot of credibility with our own people, and then also with others. And so you come around to a situation like Ukraine. I mean, it's kind of like a fairy tale, right? It's like the crying wolf or something. Like you come around to a situation where like the wolf really is there, and the situation actually is really simple. Because that's the thing about Ukraine, which is unusual, is it's like both its strategic and its moral simplicity. And people don't want to think that it's simple. Like they want to think, oh, wait, like somehow this is part of a conspiracy, or like this is somehow like Vietnam or like Iraq, or somehow, but it's actually not. It's not really like those situations. It's a country which is defending itself, and we're kind of helping on the margin, which is a good thing. But we haven't really been in that situation before. Like there aren't that many situations where democracies are defending themselves, right? I mean, Great Britain in 1940.
Yeah, Britain in 1940 is, for me, as this war began, has been going on, for me, is the one that just stands out,
Yeah, right. I mean, there's Czechoslovakia in 38 where like the democracy should have helped, but didn't. And then there's Britain in 40 where they should have and they did. We should have and we did, right? But, there aren't that many cases like this where really all we have to do is give them a meaningless percentage of our defense budget and they're going to win. And yet somehow we get ourselves tied up in these like incredibly complicated arguments, which really don't even need to happen. And the Ukrainians are understandably befuddled by, and this is I think maybe our central strategic weakness, and one that the Russians certainly exploit, our everyday assumption that it's all about us. Like no matter what's happening in the world, it must be about America in some sense. And like whether you're on the left, whether you're on the right, like I think this is kind of our national weakness. And if you assume it's all about you, then you spend a lot of time thinking about how it's all about you, and you get yourself tied up in arguments among yourselves about how it's all about you, rather than just saying, okay, there are other people in the world who have agency. The Russians have agency. They decided to invade Ukraine. The Ukrainians have agency. They decided to defend themselves. What now makes sense in terms of our own interests, both moral and political, in this situation? And like there are many things which have been wrong with our response, but I think that's a big part of it. Again, kind of regardless of where people start out politically, is that we have trouble seeing that situations are not primarily about us.
Yeah, it was not until I think after February 24th, 2022, that I went back and looked a little more detail at America First in 1940, and I of course knew about it. But I kind of assumed America First has been going in 38, 39. And then, they more famously in 1940 with Lindbergh and so forth. I didn't realize America First, the committee, the actual America First committee, was started after the invasion of the Low Countries and of France in 1940. And when the Battle of Britain was roaring in the most dramatic moments, really, of it, and that the forces, the people in the U.S., the political forces in the U.S. who wanted us to stay out, and which slid very quickly into sympathy with Nazi Germany, were more sympathetic after the brutality, after all the excuses about its German parts of Czechoslovakia, whatever, had collapsed, and after it was perfectly clear what was happening. I don't know what. I mean, you've thought a lot about the psychology, as it were, of freedom and tyranny. I mean, I don't know. I was just so struck by this. I had sort of had this naive view, I think, that they kind of stumbled into an untenable position by late 1940. They chose that untenable position in late 1940.
I appreciate your saying that because it's such an important point. And I'm going to answer it starting from somewhere completely different and then work my way back. If you look at far left sympathy for Stalinism and for the Soviet Union, when does it start to splinter? I mean, this is a story you know better than me probably, but it start the left, the European left, the North American left starts to get uninterested in Stalinism when there's no longer mass violence. So it's not that the far left, I'm talking about the extreme left now, like the communist left, but it's not that people like the Soviet Union despite the violence. They liked it because of the violence. And this is something which is very hard. Like we don't want to think this. We want to think everybody's basically a nice liberal or whatever, a nice, whatever, a nice conservative. We want to think people are basically decent souls and like sometimes they're misled. But actually, there is a taste of blood that people like. At least at a distance and sometimes in proximity. And so the reason that I'm referring to like why people didn't find the Soviet Union as sexy in the 60s as they did in the 30s is that it's consistent with what you're saying. I mean, abstracting away from the politics, right? It makes sense actually that people liked Nazi Germany after they realized what it really was. And this is what's happened with Putin's Russia as well. Like if you look at the people who are now going to Russia or who are now flogging for Russia on the internet. These are people who like the fact that Russia's killing lots of Ukrainians. They like the fact that Russia's trying to prosecute a genocide. They like the fact that Russia's pushing for a world where might makes right. They like that. There's a certain number of Americans who like people around the world, people who are not Americans who matter in America, who like this. And that is unfortunately the appeal of, I'm going to use the word fascism, that fascism is about saying, look, it's all about the one guy. It's all about this one guy who's beyond history. Look at him. He's breaking all the rules. And yes, of course, there's killing involved, but that's necessary. It's a normal. It makes us feel good. And that's what we're dealing with now. It's a big part of what we're dealing with. And although it's not always explicit on the Trump side of things, it's also part of the Trump side of things, where Trump is about how there's a strong man. It's all the succession of strong men. He doesn't pretend to be the strongest of strong men. He's kind of a link on a submission chain where Putin is obviously higher than him. But for him, it's ultimately about like who is strong and who is not. And the fact that the Russians are killing so many people in Ukraine, there's so much bloodshed, is clarifying, right? It's because that is in fact what people like. It's not just that they're tolerating it, it's what they like.
Yeah, that's for me has been such a revelation of the Trump movement as well as the war now in Ukraine, that this sort of psychological appeal of fascism. I mean, fascism broadly understood, not literally necessarily 20s, 30s European fascism, but that's something I don't know. I guess I had the more conventional. I was an anti-communist, and then the Cold War ended, and then we had I was on the interventionist side, some liberal interventionist, neoconservative interventionist side, depending on the Balkans and Middle East. But I didn't really, I don't know, I somehow put that out of my mind. You didn't, because you studied, I think, that part of the world. So, that's much more, infinitely more than I had. But I think it's it's not a happy revelation, but it's one that one should have, of course, known all along, right? I guess,
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that we dropped it in the U.S. because the whole in the 80s, we got ourselves, I'm just looking at this back, in the 80s, I was a teenager, so I'm not making an intellectual history point. But I think in the 80s with Reagan, the anti-totalitarians got themselves all focused on communism. Whereas originally the anti-totalitarian position, the Cold War liberal position, which then bled into the neocon position. But originally that position was an anti-totalitarian position and not an anti-communist position. But as time went by, and as domestic politics changed, it kind of morphed into this anti-communism position. And the anti-fascist bit was in the background. But I think that snuck up on us, and it's not just an intellectual history problem. It's also that in U.S. because we didn't think about. I mean, we didn't think about how fascism always arises at home, right? Like if you're just going to be an anti-communist, that means, okay, then the enemy's on the left or it's across the ocean or whatever. And you don't think, okay, well, here I am a conservative. Let me like look to the right and just make sure that there's not anything over there dangerous, which is going on. And I think that was a bit of a mistake because or another thing I've been thinking about is how during the Cold War they were always calling us fascists,
Right.
right? And we were always kind of saying they're like Hitler, right? Like that, we were always using the Munich analogy. And I think that also tamed people's sensibilities a little bit. That if you're constantly being called a fascist, you don't think, oh, well, maybe actually I am, or my friend is, or we could be, right? And so that we've missed, I think we've missed elements in our history which enabled that sort of thing. And the sad thing is that others haven't, the Russians haven't missed it. Like they've been trying to cultivate that in us and cultivate that generally.
Yeah, that's interesting. This is a whole different discussion we should have sometime on that. I think it's very shrewd about the history of American thinking and American foreign policy. I mean, there wasn't the fascist regimes that are out there, or semi-fascist or whatever, nasty right-wing regimes, weren't threats in the way the Soviet Union was to anyone else in particular. Mostly, I would say, in the 70s, 80s, Pinochet, whatever, and some of them democratized, and we did a little bit to help with that. We thought of China as maybe incorrectly still as communist, not as fascist, and then Putin, we were slow, obviously, in adjusting to. So there was about 20 years there where Milosevic, I think there was a liberal conservative internationalist alliance to stop that in Europe. That was kind of, and again, but it's funny, I don't recall, and I was pretty involved in that in 95, 96, or even earlier, objecting within the Bush administration in 92 to our doing nothing. But I don't recall that we really thought of it as fascism, though I think that would not be a bad term, would it? I mean, for that was a real early indicator that fascism was a possibility and an aggressive possibility in a post-Cold War world.
And I think that's an excellent point. I mean, as I recall it, the move that we often made was to say these guys are somehow invested wrongly in the past,
right.
Which of course fascists are. Fascists have this cyclical view of the past and restoring greatness, and in that way, Milosevic really was. He was somebody who talked about both. He does the thing which Putin does now and which Trump does now, which is that you somehow are both always the victim and you're always the victor at the same time. Like everybody's always against you, and somehow it always turns out well, and whatever you do is okay because you're always already the victim. But yeah, I mean, I don't think in coming out of the 80s into the 90s, a lot of the people that the United States had backed during the Cold War would have been called, if we had not been backing them, fascists. And so that's one reason why we're not sensitive to it. But I think the main reason we're not sensitive to it actually is a lack of reflection about our own history. I think that's really where that's our real problem. It's not anybody else. The problem is us.
Yeah, and certainly someone like me who'd been on the conservative side. I mean, I feel like I've personally learned a ton about, and I knew this, of course, at some level, and I was pro civil rights and everything. It wasn't, but still about the South and the Reconstruction. And I mean, it's been useful. I mean, not useful. I hate to say it that way, because it's a terrible, bad history and terrible to have to relearn under these circumstances. But really looking at what happened in between, I don't know, 1870 and 1900 or something in the South, and the combination of using the laws and changing the laws, and then the extra legal militias and so forth. It's very reminiscent, right? I mean, that I think there the American exceptionalism led us wrong too. We had blinkers on about some of that.
Yeah, well, I think folks who were coming to political maturity in the late 60s can say, okay, now we've got this right.
Right. Right. We're on the right side of civil rights. So, and
we fix it, it's all done. But of course, things that happen after civil rights, like mass incarceration and, voter suppression, are actually, continuations of that tradition, unfortunately. But the thing I wanted to say, going back to an earlier point you made, is that the racism is connected to the America First stuff. Lindbergh's, what the reason why Lindbergh likes the Nazis is that he wants to have, and I'm paraphrasing him now, but he wants to have a fortress of white people that are going to hold back the black and brown people. And his fantasy is that we have a technological advantage across the Atlantic, and together with the Germans, we can basically keep the brown and the black people out of our countries. That's it, and it's direct organic, and you see that direct organic connection too. The folks now who talk about America First or isolationism very often bleed into or quite openly on the wrong side when it comes to race. And then just as a footnote, it helps to look at the Russians, because the Russians, there are things about us they don't get. And I think Trump is going to pay for the Russians having too much influence on his campaign this time around. But they don't have any hesitation about seeing things about us that we might hesitate to see. And so they understand that our isolationism has to do with racism, and they feed that. They feed that constantly. And like, so they're like, I see them as kind of a bad doctor. Like they're a doctor who wants you to die, but nevertheless their diagnostic skills are not so bad. Like they can figure out what's wrong with you, and then they try to make it worse, right? But
Yeah,
they
well,
see that the racism and the isolationism are the same thing. And I think that's a point we should probably also be taking.
yeah, no, that's important. Yeah, well, good poisoners are know the same things as good doctors, right? This is, I think,
Yeah.
goes back to Plato and stuff. Yeah, just one last. I want to get to action, but what's likely to happen on the ground and in Russia and Ukraine and so forth in a second. But one last minor semi-political theory point, almost going back to my studies many years ago. But I mean, people my age, and I certainly was so influenced by Hannah Arendt and the origins of totalitarianism and the whole left-right horseshoe. They're both totalitarians, and so much in common, and there was some truth, I think, considerable truth to that, perhaps. And many people wrote eloquently about it, and in that respect, we did understand that there's Nazism and Soviet communism. But I think fascism is not quite the same, right? As Soviet, it's not quite as, or needn't be maybe as totalistic, I guess you'd say, right? As communism was, in terms of the real desire, allegedly at least, to shape people's every thought, and so to speak, so forth. And I feel like I wish I had known more about fascism, qua fascism, and less about totalitarianism as a big concept. And
Yeah.
and then and it's, which incidentally also made it seem like all fascism is Nazi Germany, which is not quite right for me. That Umberto Eco essay, which you must know very well from, what is it, 95, I think, on Or Fascism, and which focuses, maybe because of where he's from, on Mussolini as, in a way, a better, as the instance, and he was really the originator of it, right, in Europe.
Yeah, of course.
That was very revelatory for me, that you can have an unbelievably nasty and brutal regime. It doesn't quite look like what Hannah Arendt describes totalitarianism as looking like. And I guess that is Putin's Russia, right?
Yeah, I would agree with most of that. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, Arendt's book is brilliant, and it's been very important conceptually for me too. And a lot of my work, including Bloodlands, which you kindly mentioned, is about agreeing but disagreeing, with Hannah Arendt, or starting with some observation of Arendt's. And she's, I think, unquestionably, one of the extraordinary political thinkers of that century. But you're right that she's taking not just the Soviet Union, she's taking Stalinism, right?
Right.
If you look at the Soviet Union under Brezhnev in the 70s, it's a very, very nasty place, and there's still a gulag, but it's a smaller gulag, and it's a country which has given up on this sort of total vision of the future. But she's writing about Stalinism. And likewise, as you say, with fascism, she's writing about Hitler's Germany, and what she says about propaganda narratives, and the way that they fold all of reality into one big lie. That's much more true of Nazi Germany than it is of, fascists in Romania, or even fascists in Italy. So I think your point about the pluralism, as it were, of fascism, the plurality of fascism, is really important. Like fascism, is kind of built to fit each national tradition. Because it takes the national and turns it into the irrational, and therefore it's going to look different in each case. And also because it's not built around a party. And of course, individuals matter in the communist tradition as well, but in the fascist tradition, it really is the individual who sets the tone, and is supposed to set the tone. Right? It's the leader, the strong man. And so fascism is supposed to be different, and it is in fact different. And that leads us to these sort of these debates, which I think you've just kind of cut through, where people say, well, is it really fascism? Because let me give you a list of 11 things, and like maybe it only meets. I mean, like, that kind of misses the point, because fascism isn't really about being rational. It's about being irrational. It's about how, it's about will over reason, and the leader, and the single party. But the party's not a party. It's a movement, and it's not about institutions. It's about turning institutions into something else, right? And so, yeah, I think your point is very helpful, because I think Putin is a fascist, and I think it's taken way too long for people to realize that. And the fact that we haven't realized it has disabled, as I see it, this is maybe more my world than yours, but it's disabled a lot of people on the left, Because if you're going to one of the heartbreaking things for me about the last 10 years is that I see all these people who regard themselves as anti-fascists. Okay, if you're an anti-fascist, like that means not that you deny that fascism exists. It means that when it's there, you oppose it. And I see a lot of people who I feel like you missed your chance, or you're missing your chance. If you're an anti-fascist, you should go to Kiev right now and show solidarity. That's what you should be doing because there's fascism in the world. It's carrying out a genocidal war. And likewise, in the US, I mean, a lot of people on the far left take a view of like, well, how do I tell the difference between Biden and Trump? Like, oh, I can think of ways you can tell the difference. Like there are ways in your own tradition where you can tell the difference. But if this whole fascist vocabulary is somehow self-limiting and it's all and no one wants to use it, then I think if you're on the, again, this is not exactly my world, but if you're on the far left and you have a taboo on fascism or you deny it exists or whatever, then you're going to have a harder time talking about somebody like Trump, where there is a cult of personality, where what he's turned I mean, I'm sorry to say this, but like he's turning the Republican Party into a personality party, right? Like it's
sure.
When it's like you got people with the same last name as you who are supposed to run it and it's going to fund you, like it becomes then a personal institution like a fascist party. But if you don't have the vocabulary, then it's harder to criticize that. So anyway, I'm taking your point. There's fascism. Look, there are many different kinds of fascism, and that's not an observation one would necessarily get out of the Arendtian tradition.
Yeah, and on your point, I mean, for me, Ukraine is the most important issue in American domestic politics, partly because it really is such an important issue for the world and in many ways, and therefore for America, but also because it's so revelatory, it seems to me, about people's actual views about America, almost a little more than America itself, where you can find excuses not to see certain things, or there's someone, you know what I mean? I mean, this is so clear cut.
Yeah, I agree. It's a litmus test, and there aren't and the interesting thing is it doesn't ever really go wrong. I mean, what you tell me what you think about Russia and Ukraine, and I will tell you what you think about voter suppression. Tell me what you think about Russia and Ukraine, I will tell you what you think about a whole range of other issues. And it's quite like it with you can tell me this better than me, but with Republicans, it's really striking for me. Like the people who are able to who have because I have spent a lot of time the last couple of years talking to Republican elected officials and others about Ukraine, and the people who have a moral vocabulary about Ukraine also have a moral vocabulary about the US. It may not be my moral vocabulary, but they have one, right? There's like some set of moral commitments out there. And whereas the people who diminish Ukraine or who try to push it aside, or who repeat Russian talking points, they also don't have a moral vocabulary about the US. About the US, it's also always about criticizing, dismissing, making fun, mocking. There's nothing positive there.
Yeah, no, it's so true. I mean, that tradition of liberalism, of a liberalism that was anti-fascist and anti-communist. I was talking to actually a Democratic member of Congress, who I praised, I think on TV or something, just sounding like Scoop Jackson, and I said my first vote was for Scoop Jackson in a primary in 1972. I was a Scoop Jackson Democrat before I was a Reagan Republican. And I didn't know him that well, but he called up and said, that was nice what you said about me. But, maybe you could say Hubert Humphrey and not Scoop Jackson, because Scoop Jackson's like a bridge too far for my friends here in the Democratic Party. And I mean, I'm amazed people even know who he was mostly these days. But it was kind of a funny conversation. But Humphrey, I then actually went and read a little bit about Humphrey, whom I admired as a young man, but I didn't remember that much about his prehistory from before I was born as mayor of Minneapolis. So Humphrey was really absolute anti-fascist and absolute anti-communist, and put his own career on the line in both cases, incidentally, and at home and abroad. Fought anti-Semitism as mayor of Minneapolis it's not popular to do that. Was huge, of course, civil rights leader, and was willing to split the Democratic Party in '48 at the convention on that. Threw the communists out of the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. I don't remember exactly when, late '40s in Minnesota, but had, of course, defined himself even before that as an anti-fascist. And I mean, there was an admirable tradition there, and people were able to do those things both of those things at once. It seems like maybe that will come back. Well, let's talk about maybe say a word about Russia. I mean, what's the prospects there? Is how firm, how strong is Putin? Anything to hope for there? Then I'm curious what you think about Ukraine itself, but also about its neighbors. I mean, the European situation as we move forward. And then we can come back to the U.S., which, as you say, is both the key and sadly maybe the weaker link.
Okay, let me just pick a segue out of what you said, because I think like You're teaching me things I don't know about Hubert Humphrey. There's an awful lot I don't know about U.S. history. I'm an American and a historian, but I'm not an American historian, and I have a lot to learn. But it strikes me that in order to be an anti-fascist and anti-communist, the most important thing is you have to have a positive vision of the American future. And the thing which Russia traffics in and how Russia will win ultimately is futurelessness. That their politics is a politics without a future. It's a politics which is built entirely on myths of the past. And the war they're fighting against Ukraine is not really based upon some vision of how things will be better if we conquer Ukraine. It's based upon a vision of, lack of a vision. We don't really know what we are, and therefore we have to destroy them, because destroying them gives us a sense of what we are, right? Everything is us and them. And since we don't know who we are, like, we have to have the them. And that so all the emotional energy, all the political energy goes against them. And that can obviously sustain a war for a while, and it has sustained a war for longer than I think a lot of people expected. I think things are going quite badly for Russia, and I think the way that the only place they're really winning is in the American mind, and not just the American mind, but the only place they're winning is in people's heads. They're not really winning on the battlefield. They're doing, they've smartened up from their initial invasion, which was based on this entirely false political premise. But they're still losing an awful lot of men in order to take a relatively small amount of territory. And they're doing badly, as we talked about before, in the air and on the sea. And politically, I'm not really sure what their explanation is for going on for another year. I think they've plateaued. They've hit this plateau where Russians think the war makes sense because people have died. That it's precisely that. They're like, because my son has died, because my husband has died, because my brother has died, there must be some reason for it. And that will keep you going for a while, but it won't keep you going indefinitely. So I think they're going to have a hard time getting to 2025. And that's why they're so heavily invested in us right now. Like, that's why we've heard so much about how they're winning and Ukraine is losing and let's all throw up our hands. And this whole fatigue thing, like, everyone's supposed to be tired, which I think is completely ridiculous. Like, what are we supposed to be tired about? Like, we're just sitting here watching and occasionally voting on something that doesn't make you tired. So I think Russia's in trouble. And I think, this is, unpleasant for us, but if we don't see it, they see Capitol Hill as the shortest route to Kiev. That's how they see it. And we have yet to prove them wrong about that. So their politics are, in a sense, very closely related to our politics at this point, because they are counting on Mike Jackson Mike Johnson and on Donald Trump to get them through, right? That's their plan. Their version of victory is that we lose focus, we lose attention, we don't fund, and then they wear the Ukrainians down with the help of the North Koreans and the Iranians.
Yeah, they see Capitol Hill and then the 2024 election, obviously presidential, as their two-step path to victory. But no, it is striking. And you think that's very explicitly in their mind. They're not, that if things went differently on Capitol Hill and in 2024, it would have a pretty big effect in Russia.
Oh yeah. I mean, we're like, I know you know all this.
No.
Give me a little lecture, but in the US, we really do live in a kind of, in our own, like, we have bubbles within a bubble, but there's like one big American bubble. And in that American bubble, we have all these other bubbles. But in our American bubble, we just often, I just put it very bluntly, like, we often just don't recognize that there's a world out there which is communicating to us very clearly. So the Russians pretty much every day in their own propaganda talk about how great Trump is and how great the Speaker of the House is. We might not like that. We might not pay attention to it, but it's right there before our eyes. I mean, they literally go on screen in front of millions of their own people and say rah rah when there's not a vote for Ukraine aid. So they're not really hiding it from anybody that this is what they're up to. Their propaganda is basically an alternation between we're trying to destroy the Ukrainians and, oh, look, we have new pets in America, which is sort of how they describe the people who do what they want, because they're simultaneously praise them and they're incredibly condescending about them as well. They refer to Trump, for example, as Nasha Trumpushka, which is like, our little, I don't know, like our little Trump darling or something, like that's. So it's like they praise American political figures, but also in the sense of like, they're this like these things we sort of cuddle because we like them so much. That's how they talk about Tucker Carlson as well. Like he's very courageous compared to the other Americans, but he's also completely like our person. Let's stroke his head a little bit. So yeah, I mean, it's sorry to take so much time to answer it, but like just a really simple yes. They make it 100% clear that this is what they're doing, and and they know, unfortunately, that we're so narcissistic that we don't even notice. And anyway, for those of you like viewers who want to notice, Julia Davis does a terrific job on her in her writing and in her Twitter feed and on YouTube on just kind of summarizing Russian propaganda day to day. And that can be if there's any uncertainty about this stuff, she's very helpful on this.
And you read her, I read her on Twitter. I mean, it's so astonishingly both vulgar and I don't know, simple-minded isn't even the right word. What's what you're saying? I mean, kind of just there's no artistry and condescending to their American stooges, and that seems to have not to hurt them much. And I think maybe it's important for them at home, right, to show that they're not, that we're in charge, and when we have these fellow. I think the Soviets were a little this way too to their fellow travelers. They didn't actually treat their sort of somewhat stooge-like fellow travelers here in the U.S. or in Western Europe with great respect, right?
It's a very funny mix, I think, in both cases. I'm sorry, part of my mind is now thinking about how to translate Nasha Trimpushka. I'm now thinking of like a Trumpkin dumpling, like something like
Oh, that's
that.
good. Yeah.
But yeah, it's in both cases, there's this mixture of authentic fear of American power. And then, because I mean, this is like one of the I mean, taking a sort of a big view, I don't know if you'll agree, but objectively, the comparison between US and Russia now is nothing like the Cold War.
Right.
Right. Like there's this discourse of multipolarity, which I accept is more valid with respect to China. But if it's just a US Russia thing, it's not, there's no bipolarity anymore. The differences in power on kind of every dimension except the nuclear, and the nuclear is for most purposes irrelevant. The difference is so extraordinary. And so it's a mixture where like they are very afraid of the US because they know if the US actually gets its act together, essentially like we can win the war. And, it sounds like very condescending, but we could win the war in Ukraine without noticing, like the amount of help we have to give to the Ukrainians, which would be very significant for Ukraine. I mean, remember, like the Ukrainian economy is about 1/250th the size of the NATO economies. Russia's about 1/25th the size of the NATO economies. And so like if we actually just had a consistent policy, the scale of which wouldn't even be noticeable in our budget, we could win, right? And they know that. Like, and so whenever they get their useful idiots, the relief is so great, right? That it kind of bursts into hilarity, like, oh, look, like these people could crush us with their little finger, but look, they're not going to, because we've got Tucker, and we've got Nasha Trampushka, we've got these people. And so their relief like manifests itself in this kind of hilarity, in this kind of like, oh, well, look, the world is actually set up in such a way that we don't have to win. There are these people who are going to come and help us out.
Unique. Say a few words about Europe. I mean, generally, there are cross-cutting trends and tendencies in many different nations, and obviously the different nations are very different. But what's your general sense there, and particular things that either alarm you or cheer you up?
In general, the Europeans are doing better on Ukraine than Americans think. There's a lot of discussion about, GDP per capita, spending on defense as a percentage of GDP. Sorry, and that's a Trumpist discourse. But if you look at GDP percentage of GDP spent on the Ukraine war,
right,
the U.S. is way down the list. Like we're below Bulgaria. We're below countries that we don't even think are on the Ukrainian side. We're below Malta. We're below the Czechs. We're below pretty much everybody on that measure. And even if you take the total, the Europeans are now way out ahead of us. Different measures are slightly different things, but they're way out ahead of us. So just as a starting point, it's important for Americans to realize that we're not actually leading. We could be, and we should be. We really should be, but we're not. but it's not, the Europeans lack what we have. They don't have all the stuff on the shelf that they can give away. And, our manufacturing capacity should be, much greater than theirs, although it's not because we haven't made the right choices. In Europe, it's like different countries at different points are doing the right thing. Like at the beginning, it was the East Europeans who had been right all along and who then kind of threw what they had at the situation. You have kind of steady in the background the Norwegians who have infinite resources. And then you have the Germans who, like, in a incredibly painful set of contortions, which are unbelievably frustrating if you follow them and if you know anything about German history. Because if you know things about German history, you know that actually Germany has a very profound historical debt towards Ukraine, which they're only very slowly realizing is the case. Germany is very, very slowly, very slowly going in the right direction. And then you have the French who have been basically, Macron has seen, as, generations of French leaders before him have seen, when there's a moment of American weakness, that's a moment when France can play a disproportionate role. And Macron, I think he's doing exactly the right thing and exactly the right rhetoric, and I'm glad he's doing it. But it's really striking that that the Gaullist moment arrives when the Americans are busy, doing nothing. But what Macron, the French are doing less than other countries, but what Macron is saying now is very important because he's the one who's saying this is very clear morally and this is also very clear strategically, and he's right about those things. So I think the Europeans can get the Ukrainians through this year without a disaster. But if we want to show, if we want the Ukrainians to win, and if we want, we haven't really talked about this, but there are all these strategic gains which the U.S. gets by Ukraine winning. If we want that, the Americans are going to have to come in and help.
What about domestically, though, in Europe? How worried are you about Orban? Some countries Czech Republic, very impressive. They sort of repudiated a Trumpy type president. They've got 500,000 Ukrainians who seem to be doing fine. There's not much resentment so far as one can tell. They're being treated well and so forth. Hungary, kind of Orbanism. Where do you see the domestic trends there?
Yeah, it's interesting because kind of like if you take it as a whole, it's kind of like the U.S. where you have a strong and increasingly organized minority, which is pro-Russia, pro-Putin, pro-Russian victory, pro-fascist. And it's not a majority anywhere, but it's on the scale of Europe as a whole, it's significant, and it occupies certain important posts, like for example, the post of prime minister in Hungary. And from those posts, it can cause disproportionate damage, or it can slow things down. And then a couple more of those posts, and then you've got real problems. It's like the U.S. You don't have to have a majority which is anti-Ukraine, but you have to have a few blockers in position, which is what Putin is aiming for and what he hopes for. Public opinion it's like the U.S. Public opinion in Europe, it varies from country to country, but it's basically pretty good, and it's remarkably good given that it's been 2 years, and given that, and this has been a media discourse which I really dislike, given that since March of 22, too much of the media has been telling us how we need to be tired, right. Which is just it's meant to, it's kind of the worst of all possible forms of journalism, because it's not even a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's meant to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's now it's up to us to say, oh yeah, I read that headline and now I'm tired because I read this headline about how I'm tired. But given all that, the public opinion is not bad. And I tend to think that, there are a lot of European countries, there are a lot of elections, some are going to go well, some are going to go badly. The Polish election went the right way. The Czech presidential election, as you said, went the right way. The Slovak one went the wrong way. The Italian ones seem to go very much the wrong way from the point of Ukraine, but actually she's been fine with respect to Ukraine, right? So there are going to be elections, there's going to be a British election, and Labour is going to turn out to be exactly the same as the Conservatives on Ukraine, maybe even a little bit better. So with the exception of Germany and France, things are going to go back and forth, but I think basically it's going to be okay. Where we'll really have trouble is if Le Pen wins a presidential election in France, or if the AfD comes to power in Germany. In those scenarios, then Europe itself is going to have trouble.
Yeah. Let's close by talking about the U.S., which you said was the key link and the weak link, I think you said, or potentially, well, maybe right now the weak link and potentially the very, very weak link. What I was struck by, I was in Europe a few times a year ago, meeting with pretty senior Germans, and I think the Zeitenwende is more real than not, I guess is the way I would put it. A little bit more glass half full than half empty. And they're, especially the younger Greens in Germany, have been excellent. It's funny. I said to one of them at the end of a meeting, I never thought when I was a Reagan Republican that the party I would like the most and admire the most really in Germany would be the, 40-year-old Green leaders and not the old CDU or, for that matter, SPD leaders. But when talking to senior Germans from the foreign policy defense world, I mean, what was striking to me was what forgets this again in one solipsistic American way. We have just all these capabilities. We are a global power. We have intelligence. We have a ton of weapons. We could make a lot more and probably should be making more. We have many, many things we can do. No European country is even remotely set up that way. They're individual companies, Rheinmetall, that do very good things, individual militaries that are extremely impressive, I would say, in the Balts and the Nordic states and so forth. There are many great things. I'm not being at all diminishing them by comparison. It just as a factual matter, and the degree to which we can help in sort of day-to-day conduct of the war compared to, well, we're set up to fight wars, and to deter, and we've done quite a lot of fighting of wars, smaller ones, thank God, in the last 50 years, and obviously no European country has really. So it's sort of a very practical way. I was struck by the indispensability, if I can use a Madeleine Albright phrase, of the U.S., as well as the broader political way as well. But anyway, say a word. We'll close. But say a word about the U.S. in general, and what you would say to fellow Americans, or what prospects what worries you the most and cheers you up, if anything, the most.
Well, let me just pick up where you started, then I'll go somewhere else. I mean, the striking thing about us helping the Ukrainians is that we could help. Most of the stuff we're giving Ukraine is stuff we were going to throw away.
Right.
The systems that we've been giving Ukrainians are stuff which was obsolescent and which American taxpayer dollars were going to spend to take apart and throw away. And what we're doing right now by not doing anything is we are basically throwing away systems which, from our point of view, are too old, instead of giving them to the Ukrainians. Like the HIMARS that the Ukrainians have been using to great effect are things that we would never use because we were going to throw them away. And so it goes to this point that we have in principle all this military power, and we make ourselves laughable when our actual capabilities are so ludicrously off our theoretical capabilities. I mean, that's why the Russian propagandists have trouble containing themselves, is that the stuff that the stuff that we're going to throw away would be enough to help the Ukrainian army defeat the Russian army. But we can't get ourselves together politically enough to give the Ukrainians the stuff we were going to throw away, and that's why they laugh at us. And I mean, that may be unpleasant, but it's, we have to break out of it. Sometimes other people can help you to see ourselves. And so the US should be able to help Ukraine win this war. I mean, now switching from the Russian point of view to ours, I guess the main switch I wish we could make is I wish we could say, wow, in the last 2 years, the Ukrainians have done a lot for us. They've defended the international order. The basic principle of international order is that countries shouldn't be invading other countries and changing territory. They have held off, in large measure, a genocide. Wherever the Russians occupied, they have been killing people, kidnapping people, raping people. Holding off a genocide is not something just that Ukrainians are doing for Ukrainians. It's also a contribution to a better world. The Ukrainians are fulfilling the entire NATO mission, basically on their own. There won't be a war in Europe so long as the Ukrainians are fighting the Russian army, because there's no way the Russian army can fight another war. If Russia defeats Ukraine, of course it can. And in my view, anyway, they've made a war with China much less likely, because they're showing how offensive operations are complicated and unpredictable, and a Chinese Communist Party that doesn't want to be embarrassed is going to pay attention to that. And the Ukrainians are showing that there are people out there in the world who are willing to take risks for democracy, which is a pretty important example, I think, for us and for everybody. They're doing all those things for us. I think that's where the conversations should start. And then it's like, okay, well, then what are we doing for them? Right? What are we for this strategic bonanza and this moral example? What are we doing in return? I think that's where the conversation should be starting, because as I see it, I mean, there are a lot of reasons to care about Ukraine, and I care about Ukraine as such. But even if you're just an American concerned about American interests, there's a kind of unusual strategic opportunity here where so many things are possible for so few resources. And even if you're just a hard-headed American realist, this is a historical opportunity which you're never going to see again. And I wish people, I wish people would care about the moral issues. But even if they don't, I wish people would care about our own interests, because our own interests point in exactly the same direction here.
That's such an excellent point and eloquently stated, and I think an appropriate place to close. But we should get back together maybe after. Hopefully things look more promising in November 2024, and maybe we can talk more about the future and about a brighter future. Whereas I think, as you say so well, I mean, this 2022, 24 could be a real turning point, not just for Ukraine, but for all of us, right? I mean, couldn't it be a real inflection point in world history?
Yeah, and and it can still be a good one. It can still be a good one. Yeah. Thanks for reaching out.
Tim Snyder, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you all for joining us on Conversations.